Andrei Chikatilo, the Soviet killer the state refused to believe existed. Soviet officials insisted their society had no serial killers, that such a thing was a uniquely Western capitalist disease. So when bodies started turning up in the forest outside Rostov, dozens of them, investigators spent years chasing the wrong men entirely, because admitting what was actually happening meant admitting the state's own ideology might be wrong. Andrei Chikatilo worked for years as an ordinary Soviet schoolteacher and later a supply clerk, a quiet, unremarkable family man whose outward life gave no indication of the murders he had begun committing as early as 1978. Killing victims, primarily children and young women, he approached at train stations and bus stops across the Rostov region of southern Russia, luring them with offers of food, companionship or help, before leading them into secluded wooded areas where he committed murders of genuinely extreme brutality. The Soviet criminal justice system of this specific era operated under a genuine, deeply held ideological framework, holding that serial murder, as a specific criminal phenomenon driven by individual psychological compulsion rather than economic desperation or political motivation, was fundamentally a product of capitalist social decay, a symptom Soviet officials believed simply couldn't exist within a properly functioning socialist society. This ideological position wasn't merely rhetorical, it genuinely shaped how Soviet investigators approached the growing pattern of murders, leading authorities to initially dismiss the possibility they were dealing with a single repeat offender at all, and instead pursue a series of ultimately incorrect theories and wrongful prosecutions. In one of the investigation's most genuinely tragic failures, Soviet authorities arrested and prosecuted a man named Alexander Kravchenko for an early murder actually committed by Chikatilo, and executed him in 1983, years before Chikatilo's actual identity as the true perpetrator would ever be established, meaning Soviet authorities had already put an innocent man to death for one of Chikatilo's crimes while the actual killer continued operating freely. A wrongful execution that stands as one of the most severe documented failures of Soviet-era criminal investigation. As the pattern of murders continued through the 1980s, Soviet investigators, led eventually by a persistent detective named Viktor Burakov, gradually began recognizing they were likely dealing with a single perpetrator, despite the ongoing institutional and ideological resistance to this conclusion, and assembled an increasingly sophisticated, though still genuinely limited by Soviet-era forensic technology, investigation specifically focused on identifying patterns in victim selection, geographic clustering, and specific disturbing details of the murders themselves that suggested a consistent individual signature across dozens of separate killings. Chikatilo himself had actually come under police suspicion and been briefly detained on at least one occasion years before his eventual arrest, questioned in connection with the broader pattern of murders after being spotted near a location associated with one of the killings, but was released after a blood test conducted at the time indicated his blood type didn't match evidence recovered from crime scenes, a conclusion investigators later determined was based on a genuine, rare biological anomaly in Chikatilo's own body chemistry that caused his blood type to present differently in secretions than in his actual blood, a detail that inadvertently protected him from suspicion for additional years before his eventual capture. Chikatilo was finally arrested in November of 1990, after sustained surveillance efforts finally connected him definitively to the pattern of killings, and under prolonged interrogation, eventually confessed to 56 murders committed over more than a decade, describing his crimes to investigators and psychiatric evaluators in disturbing detail that confirmed him as one of the most prolific documented serial killers in recorded history. Chikatilo's subsequent trial in 1992 became a genuinely significant public spectacle within the rapidly transforming post-Soviet Russian state, held in a specially constructed cage inside the courtroom, specifically due to the intense public outrage and fear of vigilante violence against him from grieving family members and members of the public who had followed the case's extensive media coverage. coverage that itself represented something genuinely new in Russian society. Since the collapsing Soviet state's declining ability and willingness to suppress information about the case meant Chikatilo's crimes received the kind of open, extensive public discussion the older, ideologically rigid Soviet system would never have permitted. Chikatilo was formally convicted of 52 of the 56 murders he had confessed to, courts declining to formally attribute the remaining cases due to insufficient corroborating evidence despite his own confession, and was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head in February of 1994, a sentence carried out in the specific manner traditionally used for Russia's most serious capital cases. What makes Chikatilo's case endure as one of history's most significant examples of ideology actively obstructing criminal justice isn't simply the staggering scale of his crimes, though 52 confirmed murders places him among history's most prolific documented killers, but the specific documented way Soviet institutional ideology directly contributed to the investigation's catastrophic early failures, a wrongful execution, years of pursuing incorrect suspects, and a killer who continued operating for over a decade, partly because acknowledging the true nature of what was happening required Soviet officials to acknowledge something their own political system insisted was fundamentally impossible. If stories like this, where a rigid ideology's refusal to accept an uncomfortable truth allowed a killer to operate for years longer than he otherwise might have, are exactly what you come here for, subscribe to The Grave Details, because history holds more stories like this than most people will ever know.